Welcome to 8 Limbs, episode number 3. I'm your host, Drayton Michaels. Today we're going to be talking about shock collars and choke collars. Now, while it may seem obvious to some people, sadly there's still a large contingency of people that choose to use electronic shock collars and prong collars or choke collars. This episode of 8 Limbs will hopefully make some of you reconsider those choices and not use electronic shock or choke or prong collars on your dogs or dogs you know. Maybe you can pass this information on to somebody who has used or is using choke chains and prong collars. Let's address the choke and the prong collars first. In case anybody doesn't know, this is what we're talking about. This is a classic prong collar. It's got the prongs that are going to jab into the dog's neck, and it has the choke chain part, so it will close. Okay. Choke works as negative reinforcement after the punishment has been added to deter the dog, and the human hopes that the dog will learn to avoid the behavior that caused the pain of the choke to be delivered. The problem here is that dogs generalize fear very well, and you may also be causing physical damage to your dog as well. Many dogs will continue through the pain or the discomfort of the choke as they're more motivated by the scent or the other dog or prey, etc. Many dogs will pull to get to scent, and if they're on a prong or a choke device, they're getting a lot of low-grade pain and stress and physical punishment to that area of the body, the neck and the trachea, etc. Now, a punishment callus is a real thing, and many dogs will build a tolerance to the pain, and then what? More shock, more choke? Where does it end? So when you're adding these choking aversives, the problem becomes multiplied, not only in the physical detriment to the dog, but also their behavior can start to deteriorate. There's damage to the trachea, the neck, the back, discs, nerves. Now, with repeated use, these areas in the throat and the neck can be affected negatively, and you could end up with a dog who has a major issue, and you may not know about it unless you investigate it, and you have a chiropractor look at your dog, or a vet that understands that your dog has been on this choke device and it's been used on a regular basis. Again, a lot of these choke and prong collars are used to restrain dogs on a daily basis. So it isn't that they get choked once and they never pull, and we're going to talk about why that occurs. But usually when people have a choke chain or a shock collar or a prong collar on their dog, they're using it more than once or twice. They're using it as the preferred method to deter behavior. Now, there is a fallout for lack of oxygen. Okay, while it takes long periods of time, in the 30 to 1 minute range for brain damage, repeatedly losing sufficient oxygen does have effects on the brain. For the abusive, jerk, and choke-happy so-called trainers, know this. At 1 minute of oxygen deprivation, brain cells start dying. At 3 minutes, neurons start to suffer extensive damage. At 5 minutes, death is imminent. Now, I would hope, no dog would ever be choked, and especially not for the duration of 1, 3, or 5 minutes. This is something that people may not want to admit, but there are still people out there who will string a dog up by their neck, helicopter the dog, and cut off their air supply for a significant amount of time, in addition to damaging those areas of the neck and the trachea. Now, there's a notorious scene on a dog training TV show where the trainer, who let's call him the charlatan manipulator, where he chokes a dog until the dog just about passes out. And this was on television. So people have watched this. It's a very famous episode of this show. And to me, that's abuse, not training, period. I don't understand how it could be considered anything but abuse, to be honest. Now, while you might be thinking, I just give, the dogs a correction and they stop doing it. No, it usually doesn't work that way. So if you're thinking that, it's probably not the case in most cases. If you're using the correction with choke repeatedly, it's just not working. Stop using it. For those of you out there, and you know who you are, that are, holding dogs off their feet, using a lot of force and really jerking that prong collar or that choke collar to teach the dog, you are implementing potential brain damage and causing damage to the dog's neck, back, and throat, period. Okay? It is happening. And you may not be looking at those areas when you go for your vet exam, but you may want to consider that if you're using these items, choke collars and prong collars. When you send a dog away to one of those boot camps where they promise they're going to get the results in 2 weeks, not all of them, but many, because they're promising results, they're using choke and prong repeatedly over the course of many training sessions over the course of a few weeks. So just know that dogs generalize fear very well, and if they are choked enough and they are given enough pain via choke, what these so-called trainers are hoping is that the dog will just generalize that even a warning may get them choked. So it's very stressful for the dog, and at the end of the day, you need the real skills and not just a device that chokes the dog's neck, because you're really playing with fire. So even if the dog shuts down and they don't behave the way they were, you can still have the possibility of spontaneous recovery, and more on that in a bit. So, if you can jerk and pop a collar, you can also issue a verbal cue and condition the dog to disengage. You can issue a marker and a high-value food reward to counter condition, thus changing the dog's association. You can manage the dog with gaits. You can have more awareness on the walk and walk the dog in different areas. These are much better options than choking the dog and risking physical and behavior damages or cognitive impairment. So this device has risks. This device has potential fallout, both behaviorally and physically, for any dog that is subjected to it. So I highly recommend you don't use these. They're bad. Okay, let's talk about electric shock. So if anybody doesn't know, we're talking about an electric collar. Here are the two electrodes that go on the dog's neck. The person holds a device such as this, and there's different levels of shock, and there is a vibration, and there is a sound on this particular one. So you can emit a beep, a vibration, or electricity. All three of those may potentially cause a dog harm. When shock is administered to a dog, the same risks apply as choke, but even more so regarding the generalization of fear. And potentially the dog's either going to be shut down or possibly aggressive, which are not two ends of the spectrum you want your dog in. Now, AVSAB has a paper and references a study that tested some 200 dogs that were shocked and concluded that roughly 80% showed some sort of stress outside of the context that the shock was given. So there you go. That's the generalization of fear that I was referring to. Okay, so if you want to look up that paper by AVSAB, A-V-S-A-B, you can read all about that. Now, I realize that the proponents of shock collars will argue that not all dogs are the same, and shock collars are not meant for all dogs. But they do market them as if all dogs can be helped by them, and we'll talk a little bit more later about the false marketing of these pain devices. There's a research paper from 1968 entitled Delayed Neurological Sequelae of Electrical Injuries by Farrell and Starr. They're both MDs. Sequelae, spelled S-E-Q-U-L-E-A, means a condition that is the consequence of a previous disease or injury. Now, this translates to the dog in the following way. The dog that is repeatedly, and in some cases shocked once, may develop latent onset of behavior issues and physical issues. So if you shock your dog with an electronic shock collar or electronic containment system, there could be a latent onset of damaging effects of that electric shock. Could be days, Could be weeks, could be months. Okay, now in extreme cases, this is definitely going to be part of the dog's pathology. This study by Farrell and Starr looked at humans and animals that were shocked severely. Again, if you obtain a low-level shock once or twice, okay, most likely this is not going to have any lasting negative effects, either be physical effects or any kind of health or behavioral effects. But dogs are different than humans. So many dogs that are shocked one time severely, such as with electronic containment systems, they do have long-lasting behavioral fallouts. However, that there are people out there using shock collars daily, such as bark collars or electronic containment, to stop a dog from reacting on leash or leaving their property. Even if the dog stops the behavior it was shocked for, the dog can feel the weight of the shock collar on their neck, and they're going to associate that to fear and stress. Thus, the dog has something around their neck, this right here, and they can feel that. They know that this collar is different than any other collar they wear. And that is going to be associated to fear, and that's not good for the dog's cognition or the dog's immune system. Now, even if the dog was shocked one time and then stopped, but the collar's left on, the dog knows about that collar, and it may inflict pain. So the dog learns to avoid due to fear. Okay, not to being conditioned properly to change the association to a positive outcome, but the association is now a negative or a potential negative. Now, some of the latent fallouts of electrical shock are tremors, damages in the basal ganglia area of the brain, spinal paralysis, and various muscle atrophy. Now, while I understand that these fallouts related to shock are for extreme cases, and those who say, well, what is extreme for each dog? In my personal opinion, if the dog is shocked one time, it is extreme. There are dogs who are so sensitive that the vibration setting or the buzzer sound setting is too much. Okay, so the same argument that shock collar proponents will use, that all dogs are different, works to illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. There should not be a shock collar used for dogs because they're all different, but they all will learn the same way, which is, I've been shocked, I better not do that behavior that I just did right before I was shocked. Hopefully, anyway. Again, there's punishment calluses. There's dogs who have more motivation to work through that pain, keep chasing that rabbit, break that boundary and run into the road. So the safest way to contain dogs is fencing, secure doors, and leashes. And if you have your dog on a harness, then you run very little risk that there will be a physical problem if they are pulling or they should get a little kooky and they're jumping about. Now, I get it. People want a quick fix. I totally understand. But they're sold a bill of goods. And the dogs that it quote-unquote works for are typically shut down. And they're not doing the behavior it was shocked for due to fear of being shocked again. They're just not doing that other behavior that they were doing, whether it was barking, running out of the yard. They're doing it to avoid pain. So they have a fear. They have stress. That is what has been associated with that shock. There's no two ways about it. So a lot of people will, show videos of dogs. Look, he's panting, he's happy, he's waving his tail. Well, panting and wagging a tail could just mean adrenaline, and it could mean stress. It doesn't mean the dog's thrilled. Now, again, stress translates to immune system degradation. So shock in particular seems to have a greater risk over generalization of fear than other forms of aversive approaches, at least in my experience. In my opinion, this is due to the shock coming out of nowhere. There's usually, no beep or vibrate used. Usually people do go to the shock setting. Now, they might try the vibration or they might try the sound, the buzzer, the beep, but a lot of people don't. They go right to the shock, especially trainers, because they want results. These dogs then, if they get shocked and then they downgrade the aversive to a beep or a vibrate, a lot of dogs will just back chain that event and, they will stop, but a lot of dogs won't. So again, I refer back to the AVSAB study that I mentioned, or the AVSAB paper with the study they referenced rather, and they talk about 80% of dogs that were subjected to a shock device had some sort of stress or fear outside the context with which they were shocked. 80%. So even if you go vibrate and then buzzer and then shock, you're still applying an aversive. You're still causing the dog stress. Dogs generalize fear very well, and now you have a dog who may have an overly generalized sense of fear due to these shocks or vibrations or buzzer sounds. Dogs are learning to avoid out of fear. Okay, this translates into a higher risk of aggression, and stress can impair the dog's immune system over time. So I know I keep mentioning the dog's immune system can be degraded due to stress because that's kind of a silent killer. A dog who's either choked or shocked on a regular basis and they're shutting down, they can have immune system problems, and then you don't discover it until it's too late, because we all know that the basic vet visit isn't all that thorough of an investigation into how healthy the dog is. I've worked with dogs for 17 years. Every dog I've ever worked with that has been subjected to a shock collar has had some kind of generalized fear. They're either shut down or they're very excited and anxious. So it's in one of those areas of the spectrum. I just seen it time and time again. So you can't sell me on the idea that shocking a dog is good for the dog in any way, shape, or form. So earlier I mentioned spontaneous recovery. Let's give you the definition of spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is a term associated with learning and conditioning. Specifically, spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of a response, a conditioned response, that has been extinguished. The recovery can occur after a period of non-exposure to the conditioned stimulus. Now, this is a big subject, and it deserves its own episode. Most likely I'll discuss this again when I do an episode on leash reactivity. The empirical literature on spontaneous recovery is sparse, and there are mixed determinations as to why it occurs, but we do know that it does occur. Here are some of the agreements, and we're talking about Pavlov, Skinner, and etc. People who really have done the research. These are legitimate studies into extinction and spontaneous recovery. So some of the agreements are as follows. Extinction does not fully remove the original learning. This means that even though the dog has received aversive stimuli in the form of choke or shock, the original behavior that was learned and thought to be extinguished can come back after some time. It can be days, weeks, or months. Just know this. The dog that is choked or shocked and has been taught to avoid certain behaviors out of fear may have them return in the form of spontaneous recovery. If the setting of the environment is aligned in a certain way, spontaneous recovery can occur. Okay, so you might think that the dog has extinguished those behaviors and they've been choked and shocked sufficiently and those behaviors won't return. Well, guess what? They can. And many times they do. Then what? More choke, more shock. It's much safer to use counter conditioning with high-value food rewards. It's much better to have distance mitigation and management with fences and gates and leashes. It's better to do that than run the risk of an overly generalized fear and have fallouts in the category of stress and fear and aggression because the dog has been choked or shocked. Again, you also run the risk of physically harming the dog. So if you want safe results and sound dogs, I highly suggest that you use safe approaches to obtaining behavior. Thanks for tuning in to episode 3 of 8 Limbs. I'm your host, Drayton Michaels. I've enjoyed bringing you this information, and I hope you've enjoyed receiving it. Remember, behavior's in the environment, not in the dog, and humans are the variable as to how the dog learns about their environments. So when you choose positive approaches and safe approaches, your dog learns positively and safely about their environments. Until next time, safe and happy training. Take care of yourselves.